The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above the empty ER corridor at St. Michael's, a sound like insects trapped in glass. Midnight had passed 43 minutes ago. Most people had no idea what a hospital looked like when the world slept, the way the tile floors caught light and threw it back doubled, the way the air tasted of antiseptic and something older, something like fear that never quite left the walls even after the mop water dried. Natalie Hayes moved through the hallway with the kind of efficiency that made observation unnecessary. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation length, pressed at the seams. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She had learned, a long time ago, how to move through a space without disturbing it. 23 years of nursing had taught her that. For tours in hostile territory had perfected it. The night shift at St. Michael's in San Antonio ran on a rhythm she could navigate blind. Vitals every 2 hours in the ICU wing. A rotating census of 67 beds, though only 42 were occupied tonight. The ER got its rushes around 2 in the morning, drunk drivers, bar fights, occasional gunshot wounds from the south side. Between 1 and 2, the hospital breathed. Natalie moved through that breathing space the way she moved through everything, steady, present, invisible. Her hands were trembling again. She noticed it when she reached for a 18-gauge angiocath needle from the cart outside room 4. The tremor was small, barely perceptible, but she felt it like a betrayal. She gripped the steel edge of the medication cart and held for 3 seconds until the shaking stopped. The patient in room 4 needed the 4 line placed on the first attempt. There would be no second try. There never was, not with Natalie Hayes. She rolled her sleeves up to regulation length as she stepped into the room. Mrs. Esther Valdez, 71 years old, admitted 6 hours ago with severe dehydration and a UTI that had spread further than anyone wanted to admit. The 4 was necessary. The labs had been ordered. Natalie had the results before anyone else because she checked the computer at 11:48 p.m. when the night shift skeleton crew was minimally staffed. "Good evening, Mrs. Valdez. I'm placing your 4 now. You'll feel a small stick." Natalie's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Mrs. Valdez's body relaxed the moment she heard it. That was the thing about Natalie, patients didn't need to trust her medical credentials because they trusted something deeper. They trusted her hands. They trusted the way she moved, the way she spoke. They trusted that she had done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again. The needle went in smooth. First attempt. O2 levels registered normal. Fluid line established. The trembling had stopped entirely by the time she secured the tape and checked the catheter position with her fingers, feeling for the subtle give that meant everything was correct. What Mrs. Valdez didn't see was the faded surgical scars that ran across Natalie's forearms in patterns that didn't quite match any standardized trauma unit. The scars told their own story in a language that had nothing to do with civilian medicine. They had been made by instruments in dusty tents under desert sun, in FOB Shanks surgical aid station during a mortar attack in 2006, in places that no longer existed on any official map. She was adjusting the fluid drip when she felt the observation. The sensation of being watched, the way the air behind her changed density. She had trained for 17 years in the military to recognize that feeling, the weight of attention, the shift in atmosphere when another person's focus locked onto your position. Old habits made her cataloging, no threat present, just presence, just observation. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood in the doorway of room 4, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes tracking her movements with the focus of a man trying to solve a puzzle he'd already decided he hated. He was 46 years old, according to his credentials, old enough to have built authority, young enough to believe that authority should never be questioned. His family name carried the weight of 3 generations of physicians. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he'd never experienced real doubt in his life. He watched her hands complete the 4 check. He watched her move to the monitors and adjust the settings without looking at the manual. He watched her make a note on the chart, not verbal notes like the residents did, but actual careful handwriting, documentation that anticipated questions before they were asked. "Mrs. Valdez, I'm going to check in on you in 2 hours. If your pain changes at all, you use this button right here." Don't wait. Natalie placed the call button in Mrs. Valdez's hand and showed her the exact motion required. Simple. Clear. No room for confusion. Mrs. Valdez nodded as if she'd just been given the secrets to the universe. Natalie turned to exit the room and found Dr. Mercer blocking the doorway. He didn't move. The message was clear: he was in control of the space. He was in control of whether she could pass. It was a small thing, barely a gesture, the kind of power that only men who'd never experienced powerlessness seemed to understand how to exercise. She stopped 6 inches from him and waited. Her face was neutral. Her breathing was level. The trembling in her hands had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't anxiety. It was restraint. "You're the new night nurse," Mercer said. He wasn't asking. He was pronouncing. His voice was the kind of instrument that had been trained to sound authoritative. Even reading a phone book would have sounded like a sermon delivered from a pulpit. "I'm Dr. Mercer. I'll be attending this rotation. Natalie Hayes. Good to meet you, Doctor." Her voice came out soft, deferential, the way it always did when she was around people who had power the conventional way. The voice of someone who understood hierarchy. The voice of someone who didn't want any trouble. He stepped aside and she moved past him into the corridor. She could feel his eyes on her back. She could feel the moment he noticed something, probably the scarring visible beneath her rolled sleeves, the kind of scarring that came from field surgery, not from civilian accidents. She didn't stop walking. The night shift continued its rhythm. Room 6 needed blood cultures drawn. The chart indicated possible sepsis, though the attending physician on the earlier rotation had made a note suggesting that the patient's symptoms were likely stress-induced. Natalie drew the cultures anyway, properly labeled, properly timed. She had learned to do thorough work without drawing attention to how thorough her work was. It was a careful balance. At 1:15 a.m., Dr. Mercer appeared at the nurses' station where Natalie was updating charts. The residents had scattered to their call rooms. Most of the auxiliary staff were on break or handling other patients. It was just Natalie and the computer and the soft hum of medical equipment in the distance. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Mercer was already moving, expecting her to follow. She marked her place in the chart and stood, leaving her notebook open on the desk. She would come back to it. She always came back to her work. They walked through the corridors in silence. His shoes made distinctive sounds on the tile, expensive shoes, the kind that announced their own importance through the leather quality alone. Her shoes made no sound at all. This was intentional. They arrived at the resident's common room, which was empty at this hour. Mercer turned to face her directly. The fluorescent light above made his face look older than it was, drawn across the bone in a way that suggested he'd never quite learned how to rest. "I've been reviewing the charts from the earlier shift," he said. "I notice you've made several notations that seem to suggest diagnostic work beyond the scope of nursing practice." Natalie's hands were trembling again. She pressed them against her thighs, letting the pressure steady her. "I document what I observe, Doctor. That's part of the job. What you do is make assumptions about medical conditions. That's a doctor's job." He smiled then, and the smile was the worst part. It wasn't angry. It was the smile of someone who had already decided how this conversation would end. Nurses follow protocols. Nurses don't think they're physicians. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He was establishing the parameters of the hierarchy, and she had learned long ago not to argue with people who were establishing parameters. Some battles required you to lose the first round. Some victories couldn't be won by fighting back immediately. "I'll review my documentation," she said quietly. "Just following protocol, Doctor." He watched her face for a moment, disappointed that she hadn't pushed back, that she'd folded so easily. He'd come looking for a confrontation and gotten compliance instead. It made him suspicious in a way that simple defiance wouldn't have. Defiance could be explained. Dismissed. But compliance from someone whose eyes showed a different story, that was the kind of thing that made men like Mercer work harder to find evidence of insubordination. "Get back to your duties," he said finally. "And Hayes, next time, you ask me before you deviate from protocol. Understand?" "Yes, Doctor." She walked back to the nurse's station and returned to her charts. Her hands had stopped trembling by the time she sat down. In the distance, an ambulance siren grew closer, then louder, then faded again into the night. Room 8's monitor beeped softly, not an alarm, just the quiet notification that something needed attention. And that's when the real nightmare began. The next morning, the sepsis patient, Mr. Chen, 62, admitted with what Mercer had coded as acute gastroenteritis, was crashing. Natalie had been watching his numbers for 6 hours. Lactate climbing. Urine output dropping. The fever he'd arrived with had finally registered in Mercer's consciousness, but not before Natalie's clinical notes had logged everything: the timeline, the vital progression, the inflammatory markers screaming sepsis from a perforated bowel. She was checking his for access when Mercer swept in with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras. The family stood near the bed, Mr. Chen's daughter in a surgical mask, her husband keeping his distance from the monitors as if they might bite. Mercer pulled the chart. His eye scanned her nursing notes. The silence stretched. Then he looked up, and she felt the temperature in the room drop 5 degrees. "Nurse Hayes," he said, voice smooth as polished steel, "this is a teaching hospital, not a battlefield triage tent. You don't make diagnostic calls." The words landed exactly where he'd aimed them, public, deliberate, loud enough for the family to hear. His presence filled the space like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and the promise of something worse. One of the residents, a young man named Chen himself but no relation, glanced at his colleague. The family exchanged the kind of worried look people get when they realize the doctors don't know what they're doing. Natalie took one measured breath. Her hands had moved through 19 combat surgical procedures under fire. They were not going to shake now. She met Mercer's eyes and spoke in the clinical tone she'd perfected across 18 years in operating rooms and hospital wards. The lactate levels indicate metabolic acidosis. His urine output dropped 30% in the last 2 hours. Those findings suggest. "I'll handle the medicine, Nightingale," Mercer cut her off. He stretched out her call sign, bent it, made it sound like a child's insult instead of what it was. A name earned in Ramadi. A name that had come from a surgical team under mortar fire who'd said she moved through chaos like something that couldn't be touched. He'd turned it into mockery in front of a patient's family and 2 residents who would repeat the story in the cafeteria, in the locker room, in texts to other programs. Something hot and liquid rose in her chest. She felt it like acid, not fear, not anger, something older and more dangerous. The trembling started in her left hand. A single tear escaped her left eye. She didn't look away from Mercer. Her hand moved up, wiped the tear with one precise gesture, and never broke eye contact. Her voice dropped to something quieter, something that made the young resident lean in to hear it. "I've seen what happens when pride kills patients, Doctor." She walked out of the room before anyone could respond. Behind her, the daughter asked, "Is she right?" About the sepsis, and Mercer's voice was already launching into explanations, already controlling the narrative. Natalie didn't stay to hear it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like something mechanical and dying. Her badge felt heavy against her ribs. By that evening, Mr. Chen was in the ICU with septic shock and a perforated bowel that should have been caught 12 hours earlier. By the next morning, Natalie's isolation had begun in earnest. The break room sat on the 3rd floor, painted a color that was supposed to be calming but looked like illness. 4 nurses sat at the table when Natalie pushed through the door: Karen, Jessica, Miguel, and a float from the night shift she didn't know well. They were laughing about something. Coffee steamed from their mugs. When Natalie entered, the laughter stopped like someone had hit a switch. She moved to the far end of the table and set down her lunch container, a sandwich she'd made at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come, a banana she'd grabbed from home. The silence was so complete you could hear the refrigerator compressor kick in from the corner. One by one, they gathered their things. Karen stood first, taking her coffee. Then Jessica. Then Miguel, who wouldn't meet Natalie's eyes. The float nurse lingered just long enough to establish it wasn't personal, just logistics. Before she left, she paused at the door. "It's nothing personal, Natalie," Karen said. The words meant kindly, which somehow made them worse. "We just can't afford to be associated with problems." The door closed. The refrigerator hummed. Natalie sat alone at the table, her sandwich untouched, and looked down at her trembling hands as if they belonged to a stranger. She recognized the trembling for what it was, not fear, but restraint. Muscle memory wanted to break something. She held still instead. Through the break room window, she could see into the hallway. Mercer stood there with the 4 nurses, and she caught his voice carrying through the door. "Overstepping scope of practice is a liability for everyone. The hospital could face serious legal exposure. I'm sure you all understand." Understanding. That was what they called it when you chose comfort over truth. She'd seen that too. In Ramadi, officers had understood plenty of things that got men killed. She folded her hands on the table and waited for them to pass. The formal notice appeared the next morning on the unit board in the main hallway. The notice that doctors posted when they needed everyone to know they held the power. Disciplinary action, N. Hayes, insubordination and unauthorized medical decision-making. Details of what she'd said to Mercer about the sepsis patient. Details of who'd heard it. A recommendation for immediate retraining. The signature at the bottom in his careful, precise handwriting. Staff gathered around it like it was something fascinating, which meant it was something devastating. Natalie arrived for her shift and saw the crowd before she saw the notice. 3 nurses reading. 2 residents pointing. A medical student with her phone out, photographing the document. Natalie pushed through to the board and read her own destruction in neat hospital font. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing stayed steady. She was built for steadiness. That was the one thing Mercer didn't understand. Steadiness wasn't natural. It was learned. It came from surviving the unsurvivable and choosing to show up the next day anyway. Mercer stood 30 feet away, arms crossed, waiting to see her break. Watching her the way a predator watches prey that hasn't realized it's been marked. One of the nurses, Jessica, who'd brought Natalie coffee 2 weeks ago and called her a mentor, muttered to another nurse, maybe she should stick to bedpans. The anger that had risen like acid in the patient room came back. Natalie let it come. She let it move through her like wind through a canyon, and then she set it down and picked up her composure like it was armor. Mercer added his voice from across the hallway. Some people confuse confidence with competence. Dangerous in medicine. Words designed to ripple outward, to poison everyone who heard them, to make her seem reckless instead of skilled. She turned to face him directly, and she felt the moment shift. Something in her posture changed. The nurses sensed it before they understood it. Mercer's jaw tightened. She let one tear escape, just one, just enough to look human, and wiped it with the same precise movement, never breaking his gaze. "I've seen what happens when pride kills patients, doctor," she said, and her voice was different this time. Quieter. Emptier. The kind of quiet that comes from having already survived the worst. She walked to the locker room before anyone could respond. The hallway seemed to part for her. No one understood why. They would later. The locker room was empty. She sat on the wooden bench in front of her locker and pulled out the photograph she kept hidden, not in her wallet, not anywhere visible, but taped to the inside of her locker door where only she would see it. The unit patch. Faded. Threads coming loose where it had been sewn into a jacket lining 18 years ago. Behind it, in her memory, the face of a young woman in desert fatigues, a medical bag across her chest, and a call sign that meant she moved through chaos untouched. That woman felt very far away. She'd been erased. Put into a database in Virginia marked terminated and he cleared for civilian reassignment. She'd become Natalie Hayes, RN, and she'd done it so completely that she'd almost believed it herself. Almost. The trembling in her hands continued. Not fear. Restraint. The kind that comes from being ordered by the Pentagon to disappear, from signing documents that said she could never speak her own name aloud again, from knowing that one wrong move would bring them looking. And yet here was Mercer, with his arrogance and his institutional power, trying to erase her again. The photograph felt sharp against her fingertips. She was still holding it when the siren started wailing outside, distant at first, then closer, then impossible to ignore. 2 a.m. Ambulance. Emergency. And somewhere in that chaos, the woman she'd buried was about to be resurrected, whether she wanted it or not. The sirens hit first. 2 of them, wailing through the San Antonio night like something wounded, and the automatic doors of St. Michael's ER shuddered open to the smell of diesel exhaust and wet asphalt. It was 2:07 a.m. The paramedics rolled in fast, a gurney carrying a male in his 30s, unconscious, jaw slack, the left side of his face already swelling purple from impact. Highway accident, they called out. Vehicle versus guardrail. No identification on scene. Natalie was already moving before the words finished, her practiced eye reading the injuries like a language most nurses never learned to speak. Compound fracture of the left radius. Possible pneumothorax. Abdominal contusion. The patient's breathing shallow and rapid, oxygen sat dropping. She cut away his jacket with trauma shears, the sound sharp and efficient, metal against fabric, and that's when her hands went still for exactly 1 second. Sewn into the lining, so carefully stitched that only someone looking for it would find it, was a faded unit patch. The colors had bled into each other over years, but the insignia was unmistakable. 75th Ranger Regiment. Her fingers didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She kept working, kept moving, kept her face a mask of professional focus while something ancient and carefully buried shifted in her chest. Trauma shears, she said, her voice level. A resident handed her another set without question. She continued cutting away the torn jacket, and that's when it fell. The badge clattered onto the metal tray with a sound like a gunshot in a quiet room, and Natalie's world compressed into a single point. A Ranger tab. Operator insignia. The combat credentials of someone who'd spent years doing exactly what she'd spent years pretending she'd never done. Dr. Mercer was watching from across the trauma bay. She felt his gaze like a weight, but she didn't meet it. She focused on the patient, on the work, on the one thing that had always steadied her, the thing in front of her that needed fixing. The patient's breathing deteriorated at 2:14 a.m. His oxygen saturation dropped to 78%, then 71%. His chest wall was tight, rigid. The left side wasn't moving. Natalie looked at the monitor, looked at the patient, looked at the equipment. No attending physician. No authorization. No time. She'd made this decision before, in a dusty medical tent with mortar rounds walking across the roof like footsteps. The decision to act or to watch someone die while waiting for permission. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, she said. The resident froze. Now. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory pulling the needle into the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The pop of the pleural membrane was almost gentle. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a long exhale. The patient's oxygen saturation jumped. 81, 84. 88, stable. She didn't look at Mercer. Didn't acknowledge the way he'd stepped forward, his mouth opening. Didn't register anything except the climbing numbers on the monitor and the patient's improved color and the fact that she'd just broken Protocol 7.3.2 in front of at least 6 witnesses. The retired Army officer in the next bed had seen the whole thing. He was conscious, lucid, post-op from an appendectomy, and he was staring at her with an expression that moved from surprise to recognition to something deeper. Something like understanding. He waited until Natalie passed him again, and then he whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "That's remedy technique," he said. His eyes held hers for one long moment. Only combat medics from 06 do it that way. Natalie didn't respond. She didn't even slow down. She turned and walked away, moving through the ER like she wasn't carrying a decade of classified operations in her muscle memory, like she wasn't someone who'd been officially erased from every database the federal government maintained, like a single conversation couldn't dismantle the entire fiction of her life. Mercer found her in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3. His face was controlled, but his eyes held that particular gleam of righteousness that came from catching someone in a violation he could weaponize. He was already building the case in his head. She could see it happening. "You performed an invasive procedure without attending authorization," he said, his voice low and pitched for her ears only. Protocol 7.3.2 is explicit. Needle decompression requires physician approval before initiation. "He was crashing," Natalie said. Her voice was steady, reasonable, deferential. The voice of someone who understood their place in the hierarchy. "I paged twice. No response. O2 saturation was 68 and falling." "Irrelevant," Mercer said. The word landed like a hammer. "There are channels. There are proper procedures. You circumvented both. I'm filing an emergency complaint with administration. You're suspended pending review." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked back into the trauma bay, and Natalie watched him begin the process of dismantling her life with the precision of someone who'd been planning it since the moment she'd correctly diagnosed Mr. Chen's sepsis. He pulled two residents aside. She watched them write statements. She watched him photograph the equipment, the chart, the timeline. She watched him invoke Protocol 7.3.23 times on 3 separate forms, building a documentation trail that was ironclad and deliberate and absolutely insurmountable. By 11:56 p.m., he delivered it all to the CEO's office. Incident reports. Witness statements. Formal request for immediate termination. Every I dotted. Every T crossed. The work of someone competent enough to be genuinely dangerous. Security came at midnight. 2 officers in dark uniforms, professional and apologetic in that way security guards always are when they're doing something they know is wrong. Her badge was confiscated at the door. The borrowed scrubs she wore, she'd given her jacket to a patient who was cold, a man waiting for a CT scan who'd been shivering, were all she had left of the life she'd been permitted to live in San Antonio. She couldn't tell them why walking out of that hospital felt like watching a landmine activate in slow motion. Couldn't tell them that Captain Natalie Hayes had died in Ramadi in 2006, that the military had erased her from every database, that she'd spent 18 years building a new identity on a nursing license that didn't technically belong to her, that one retired Army officer's whispered recognition was the beginning of the end of everything she'd constructed. She walked to the parking lot. The night air was thick with humidity and the smell of rain coming in from the west. Her car was parked in the back corner, a 2008 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, and she sat in the driver's seat without turning the key. She sat there for 4 minutes, her hands resting on the steering wheel, and she could feel something shifting inside her. Not fear. Fear was a luxury she'd lost a long time ago. This was something else. Something like inevitability. The truth had a way of finding you, no matter how deep you buried it. She started the car and drove toward the highway, toward the empty 24-hour diner on Route 77 where they served coffee that tasted like regret and served it to people like her, people who'd learned to carry impossible secrets until the weight of them started bending the supporting structure. She had no idea what was waiting for her, no way of knowing that at that exact moment, 5 hours from now, a Pentagon officer would be making calls. That a helicopter would be requested. That the life she'd been living was about to collide with the one she'd been running from since the day she'd been ordered to disappear. But something in her movements, as she pulled out onto the empty road, had changed. Her posture had shifted. Her hands on the wheel held a different kind of tension. The quiet nurse was waking up. Dr. Mercer pulled her into the hallway outside Bay 4 before the sun came up. His voice dropped to something poisonous, something meant only for her ears. Protocol 7.3.2, he said. Attending physician approval required for any invasive intervention. She had performed a needle decompression without his authorization. Without his presence. Without his permission. His eyes held the satisfaction of a man who'd finally found the weapon he needed. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply listened as he explained how he'd already begun documenting everything, the procedure, the unauthorized decision-making, the moment she'd crossed from nursing into the territory of playing doctor. By 6 a.m., incident reports were filed. By 7 a.m., witness statements from 3 residents who suddenly remembered seeing her act without supervision. Compliant residents. Residents who understood which way the wind blew and who controlled their future. By 9 a.m., Dr. Mercer had submitted his formal request for her immediate termination, citing unauthorized procedures and insubordination. He'd built his case like a surgeon building a case for amputation, careful, methodical, impossible to argue against. The documentation was immaculate. The witnesses were in place. The protocol was clear. She had violated hospital law, and now that law would expel her. By midnight, security arrived at her locker. 2 officers. Professional. Neither looked her in the eye as they escorted her toward the exit. She was still wearing the borrowed scrubs, the one she'd pulled on 12 hours ago during the chaos of the Rangers' arrival. She'd given her jacket to Mrs. Patterson in the waiting room, an elderly woman shivering despite the Texas heat. The jacket had been warm from her body. Mrs. Patterson had needed it more than she needed the illusion of professionalism. So she left St. Michael's in borrowed scrubs that didn't quite fit, her badge confiscated, her access cards voided, her name already being scrubbed from the rotation schedule. The hallway felt longer walking out than it ever had walking in. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. But something behind her ribs had cracked open, and she could feel the pressure building, the way pressure builds before a ceiling collapses. 3 hours later, she sat in an empty diner on Highway 37, 15 miles outside San Antonio. The kind of place that existed between night and morning, fluorescent lights flickering over cracked vinyl booths, a coffee pot that had been sitting on the burner since 11 p.m. She'd ordered coffee. She hadn't touched it. The cup was cold now, a thin skin of cream congealing on the surface. Outside the window, the highway was empty. No headlights. No movement. Just darkness and the occasional gust of wind that made the diner's front door rattle in its frame. The waitress had stopped asking if she needed anything around 2:53 a.m. Now it was 3:17 a.m., and Natalie was the only customer. The only person within sight who still existed. She stared at her reflection in the dark window and didn't recognize what looked back. The scrubs. The bare wrists where a watch should be. The face that had learned, 14 years ago, to become someone else. Someone safe. Someone who could hide in plain sight. Captain Natalie Hayes had been erased from every database, every official record, every place where she might have existed. The army had ordered her to disappear so completely that even she sometimes forgot there had ever been a woman named Hayes. Instead, there had been a nurse. Just a nurse. Competent. Quiet. Forgettable. Someone Dr. Mercer could dismiss without consequence. Someone the world could crush and no one would notice because she'd already been trained to leave no marks. But the soldier in the reflection, the one staring back from the glass, she was different. She'd surfaced for 5 minutes to save a ranger's life. 5 minutes of truth. And now she'd lost everything built in 14 years of lies. The job. The apartment lease under the wrong name. The bank account that didn't trace to anywhere real. Even the identity was contaminated now. They would find it. Once you broke the surface of a ghost, the whole thing evaporated. The bell above the diner door chimed. She didn't look up. The sound of footsteps. Sneakers on linoleum. The booth across from her shifted slightly as someone sat down. She kept staring at her reflection. Marcus. Her son. 17 years old. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Eyes that looked like hers, pale green, the color of winter. Eyes that shouldn't be here. Not at 3 a.m. Not on a dark highway outside San Antonio. Marcus. What are you? It's 3 in the morning. You should be. He didn't let her finish. He reached into his backpack and set something on the table between them. A wooden box. Military issue. Government grey. The edges worn smooth from handling. The kind of box she recognized from another lifetime. I went to the storage unit. No. The word caught in her throat. The one you told me never to open. She couldn't move. Couldn't speak. The pressure behind her ribs suddenly had a name, terror. Marcus opened the box. Inside, arranged with military precision, were the pieces of a life she'd buried. A silver star with its pale blue ribbon. A bronze star with the Vela device. 2 purple hearts. Commendation letters with her real name printed on official army letterhead. And beneath them all, a photograph, Captain Natalie Hayes in uniform, bars on her shoulders, face young but already carrying something the uniform couldn't contain. Mom. His voice was steady in a way that made him sound old. I read everything. I know what you did in Ramadi. I know why you disappeared. She couldn't speak. The composure that had held for 14 years simply shattered. Tears came, not the single tear she'd allowed herself before Dr. Mercer, but tears that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that remembered what it felt like to be real. They ordered me to vanish. If I surface, if anyone knows, they made me sign documents. 14 years, Marcus. If I break cover, the implications for the operation. That ranger at the hospital. Marcus's hand stayed on the wooden box. His voice didn't waver. He's one of yours. She looked at him. His unit is already looking. They found the combat badge in your jacket. They're asking questions. The Pentagon is tracking it. The room spun. The fluorescent light seemed too bright suddenly. The coffee maker gurgled in the background like some kind of warning. I can't. Marcus, I can't. They'll pull the entire operation. They'll. You saved his life tonight. Marcus opened the box wider, and the light caught the silver star, sent it fracturing across the table. You saved for soldiers in Ramadi. You don't get to hide anymore. Her hands had started to shake, not from fear now, but from something else. Something like hope. Something like the moment before a breach, when you stop whispering and start moving forward. Marcus closed the box. Kept his hand on it. I'm not asking permission. The silence stretched between them. Through the diner window, she could see the highway was still empty. But something was changing. The darkness was lifting at the edges. Somewhere beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights, dawn was moving toward them like a tide that couldn't be stopped. She reached across the table and placed her hand over her son's. For the first time in 14 years, Captain Natalie Hayes didn't look away. By dawn, the parking lot of St. Michael's looked like a news convention. 3 news vans. 7 satellite trucks. Reporters in blazers stood practicing their serious faces while cameramen adjusted angles. Natalie pulled into the employee entrance, not the main drive where cameras clustered, and Marcus sat beside her in the passenger seat, the wooden box resting on his lap like he was carrying something alive. You ready for this? He asked. She didn't answer. Readiness wasn't the right word for what she felt. This was what happened when 14 years of careful erasure ended in a single night. The Pentagon didn't do anything quietly. Inside, the lobby hummed with energy like before a storm, that electric pressure change that comes when institutional power enters a room. Military uniforms mixed with hospital staff. A 2-star general stood near the information desk, his sleeve bearing the insignia of U.S. Army Central Command. Media credentials hung around necks. A young Army officer in dress blues held a phone to his ear, talking low and fast. The Ranger patient, the one from the highway crash, the one whose combat badge had fallen like a confession onto her instrument tray, stood in a hallway in a hospital gown, supported by 2 soldiers. His eyes were clear now. Conscious. Alert. When he saw Natalie, something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Not of the face, they'd never met before the ER, but of something deeper. The bearing. The hands. The way she moved through space like she'd already calculated all the exit routes. "Nightingale 6, he said. His voice was hoarse but steady. Not a question. A call sign spoken aloud for the first time in 14 years. The soldiers beside him stiffened. One of them, Staff Sergeant with a 75th Ranger Regiment patch, stepped toward Natalie. "Are you Captain Natalie Hayes?" She said nothing. Let the silence answer. He pulled out his phone. Pressed it to his ear. Spoke 3 words, "We found her." 30 seconds later, a major emerged from a side corridor with printed documents. He held them like they were classified, because maybe once they had been. His uniform bore the insignia of Army Special Operations Command. He read from the page in a voice that carried across the lobby and stopped every conversation mid-sentence. Captain Natalie Hayes. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Ramadi. Performing field surgery under fire. He paused. Let each word settle. That surgery saved for soldiers. For men who came home because of her. He looked up from the page. Those are your official military records. Restored as of 0400 hours this morning. The lobby went dead silent. Mercer pushed through the crowd like he was still moving through a hospital where he held authority. His jaw was already working on something defensive. This is absurd. A combat record doesn't change the fact that she violated Protocol 7.3.2. Anyone can claim military service. The badge proves nothing about her qualifications as a. The 2-star general turned. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3 steps. He stopped directly in front of Mercer. His uniform bore 3 stars worth of ribbons, deployments, combat commands, 3 separate tours in places where the air smelled like diesel and dust and blood. His eyes were the color of a loaded weapon. Dr. Mercer, the general said. Just his name. No rank. No formality. Just the way a superior officer addresses someone who's made a catastrophic error in judgment. Marcus stepped forward. The wooden box was open now. Inside, arranged on aged velvet, were medals. A silver star. A bronze star. 2 Purple Heart ribbons. Each one reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights like they were pulling the attention of everyone in the room. The general saluted them. Not casually. Not the abbreviated gesture for a civilian. A full, slow, deliberate salute, the kind reserved for the fallen, the kind that means respect so deep it transcends rank. He held it for 3 full seconds. The message was clear. This woman in scrubs holding her son's hand was not a nurse playing soldier. She was a soldier playing nurse. That's when the phone rang. Not Natalie's phone. A hospital phone, someone's desk phone, patched to the lobby speaker system by a technician standing near the information desk. The voice that came through was clipped, efficient, military precision in every syllable. St. Michael's Hospital, this is Pentagon operations calling for Captain Natalie Hayes. We've been tracking the call sign Nightingale 6 for 5 hours since the combat badge was flagged in your system. A pause. Captain Hayes, your cover is officially lifted. Your military record is restored in full. You are no longer classified as deceased. Welcome home. Mercer's face went white. Not embarrassed white. Erased white. The color of a man watching his last argument vanish. But worse was coming. 20 minutes later, the video started circulating. A young military visitor, one of the soldiers waiting in the ER lobby the night before, had filmed it all. Shot it on his phone during the chaos of the Ranger patient's arrival. The footage showed Mercer doing something that would destroy a man's career. He'd walked to the instrument tray. Picked up the combat badge. Held it up to the camera like he was examining a fake. Then he'd smiled. That small, dismissive smile that had destroyed so many people. This doesn't make her qualified, Mercer said into the camera. Anyone can pick up a badge. She's a nurse playing soldier. The video had 2 million views by noon. Comments flooded in from Reddit, from military forums, from veteran organizations with combined followings of 10 million people. The Texas Medical Board received 3,000 emails before lunch. Military Times called for comment. Fox News picked it up by 1 p.m. CBS by 2. By 4 p.m., the video was the number 2 trending topic on Twitter, #Nightingale6 spreading like the video itself had been sent by some invisible command structure. The CEO of St. Michael's watched the video in her office with the door closed. Her name was Helen Reeves, and she'd been running hospitals for 31 years. She understood institutional damage the way military officers understand collateral casualties. She picked up the phone and called hospital legal. Risk management. Board relations. Get me Mercer. And get him now. The meeting happened in a conference room on the administrative floor. No windows. Just mahogany and bad lighting and the smell of fear sweat mixing with coffee. Mercer sat across from Reeves, hospital counsel, and the director of risk management. His hands were on the table. Not shaking. Doctors didn't shake. But his knuckles were white. David, Reeves said, and using his first name was the kill shot. You confiscated a patient's military property. In front of cameras. Then you mocked a decorated combat veteran on live video that is currently being viewed by members of Congress. Mercer tried. I was protecting hospital protocol. You violated patient rights, the counsel said flatly. Military property law. And created what the Pentagon is now calling a national security incident because you forced them to burn a 14-year classified cover to protect her. By evening, the calls had started. Mercer's personal cell phone buzzed at 6:24 p.m. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. But something in his chest made him pick it up. David. The voice was old. Familiar in the way that shaped everything Mercer had become. Dr. Raymond Cole. 73 years old. The man who'd written Mercer's residency recommendation. The man who taught him that medicine was about hierarchy, about knowing your place in the chain of command that extended up from resident to senior staff to him. Dr. Cole, who'd been Mercer's god in scrubs. Sir, Mercer said. And he was a resident again. Young. Eager. Terrified of disappointing this man. I just watched the video, Dr. Cole said. David. I need you to understand something. I didn't train you to be cruel. I didn't teach you to mock those who serve their country. You disgraced everything. Everything I tried to instill in you. Mercer opened his mouth. I'm calling the board myself, Dr. Cole continued. I'm recommending they revoke your license. You don't deserve the letters after your name. The line went dead. The formal board review started 12 hours later. That phone call from a legendary surgeon triggered something in the institutional machinery that Mercer couldn't stop. When a physician of Dr. Cole's stature demands investigation, the board doesn't ask questions, they move. By morning, Mercer was on administrative leave. His hospital privileges suspended. The residents he'd pressured into signing witness statements against Natalie came forward, recanting everything. One after another. Karen Rodriguez, the charge nurse. Jeremy Chen, the resident. They detailed how Mercer had threatened their careers, how he'd said they'd lose their positions if they didn't cooperate. Legal reviewed every incident report he'd filed. 8 months of documentation. All targeting Natalie. All traceable back to the moment she diagnosed sepsis before he could. None of it held water. By the end of the week, the Texas Medical Board moved to revoke his license pending full investigation. St. Michael's formally terminated his employment for cause. No severance. No references. No safety net. Dr. Raymond Cole published a statement in JAMA. It didn't mention Mercer by name. It didn't need to. A physician who weaponizes his authority against the vulnerable has forgotten the oath, Cole wrote. Medicine requires humility. Not hierarchy. Not cruelty. Humility. Mercer sat in his empty office at 5 p.m. on a Friday, a cardboard box in front of him, security waiting by the door. His diploma was coming off the wall. His photographs. The journal articles with his name in print. All of it was being boxed up like he'd never existed here at all. 6 months later, the afternoon light came through the windows of a new office, this one with a view of San Antonio's skyline. The VA Trauma Center, East Wing, 3rd floor. The nameplate read, Captain Natalie Hayes, Director of Combat Integrated Emergency Medicine. She wore the uniform now. Not scrubs. Army combat uniform with captain's bars on the sleeves. Her hands, those scarred hands that had held people together, moved with the same precision they always had, except now everyone understood what they were capable of. Around her office, a team of combat-trained medics and civilian nurses worked on integration protocols. How to bring military field triage into civilian emergency response. How to recognize the signs of blast trauma, penetrating wounds, pressure injuries that only happened on battlefields. The wall of her office held 3 objects. The faded unit patch, framed, mounted, the cloth still carrying the wear of 14 years in a hidden pocket. Beside it, the combat badge, gleaming under professional lighting. Below both, a photograph, Marcus on the day he'd carried the wooden box, his face proud, his hand on his mother's shoulder. The Ranger patient visited monthly. He'd recovered fully, she'd saved his life with the needle decompression, but it was the combat badge that had saved her. He now worked as the VA liaison, training staff on how to recognize military identifiers, how to make sure no veteran came through their doors without being known. The conscious patient from the neighboring bay, the one who'd recognized the remedy technique, was now the trauma center's official military liaison. 17 other hospitals had requested Natalie's training protocols. Her methods were changing how America's civilian hospitals handled combat-related injuries. In the break room, nurses gathered around her. Asking questions. Seeking advice. She'd become the mentor that hospital culture had tried to prevent. Her authority came from competence now, not hierarchy. From the fact that she'd survived things that would have destroyed lesser people. From quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. The CEO called on a Tuesday. Captain Hayes, we've had inquiries from Johns Hopkins, UC San Francisco, Mayo Clinic. They all want your training program. Natalie smiled quietly. Just doing what I was trained to do. Across the city, in a community college classroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and disappointment, Dr. David Mercer stood in a polo shirt teaching CPR to bored students. Minimum wage. No authority. No respect. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy with a name tag that read Danny. The students scrolled their phones. One asked without looking up, "Weren't you a real doctor once?" Mercer didn't answer. Didn't look up from the dummy. Just kept pushing down on plastic ribs. Marcus visited his mother's office after school one evening. He was 17 now, filling out applications. West Point. Naval Academy. Considering what his mother had been, what she'd made of the silence. They sat in her office as the San Antonio light turned gold and then red and then purple. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked. "Staying hidden for so long." Natalie looked at the unit patch. The combat badge. The photograph of them both. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's survival. Until it's time to speak. She handed him a framed photograph, old, worn, dated 2006. Her unit in Ramadi. 23 faces. 5 of them not coming home. 18 men who lived because of the woman in the center of the frame, her arm around a wounded private, her eyes clear as glass. Marcus studied it. "When you get to the academy," Natalie continued, "remember something for me. The credentials matter less than the character. The uniform matters less than the oath. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimated." Marcus nodded. He understood now. Not just intellectually, but the way children understand their parents, through the scars, through the silence, through the strength it takes to rebuild yourself with your own hands. The office light caught the combat badge one last time as they sat together in the dimming afternoon. Outside, the VA Trauma Center hummed with the work of saving lives. The legend of Nightingale 6 no longer buried. Finally, after 14 years, finally serving in the light. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.